The streets were quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that seemed to amplify every little sound. The soft crunch of gravel under shoes, the distant hum of a passing car. It all painted a picture of a peaceful neighborhood settling into the night. It was a time when most people were either home with their loved ones or winding down after a long day. But not everyone. On a dimly lit sidewalk, a young boy walked briskly, his worn sneakers slapping the pavement with each step. He wasn't in a rush for anything in particular. It was just how he moved, with purpose even when there wasn't any. He was tall for his age, lean but strong, and had a quiet confidence about him that didn't need words. His old-school backpack hung low on his back, swinging slightly with his pace. As he turned the corner near the park, something caught his eye. A figure slumped on the ground just beyond the streetlight's reach. At first, he thought it was just someone resting, but as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. It was an elderly woman, clutching her leg, her face twisted in pain. The boy hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with both relief and embarrassment. "I slipped," she said, her voice trembling. "I think I've hurt my leg. I can't seem to stand." She was trying to keep her composure, but the fear in her eyes was hard to miss. It wasn't just the injury. She was alone, vulnerable, and unsure if anyone would stop to help. The boy glanced around, but the street was deserted. Without a second thought, he knelt beside her. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'll help you." He could see the tear in her stockings and the blood staining her knee. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to make walking impossible. He looked down at his own shirt, an old but clean white tee, and made a decision. Grabbing the fabric, he tore a long strip from the bottom. The sound of the ripping cloth echoed slightly in the quiet street. The woman gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh no, you don't have to do that," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. The boy simply shook his head. "It's just a shirt," he said with a small smile, his hands already working to tie the makeshift bandage around her knee. His movements were careful, almost gentle, as if he understood how much pain she was in without her having to say a word. When he finished, he stood and offered her his hand. "Can you lean on me? I'll get you home." She hesitated, her pride warring with her need for help. But the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable, and she slowly reached out, letting him help her to her feet. The journey back was slow. The boy adjusted his pace to match hers, staying close so she could lean on him whenever her leg wobbled. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes kindness didn't need a reason or an explanation. By the time they reached her small house, the porch light was glowing warmly, casting a welcoming glow on the dark street. The woman fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly. Once inside, she sank into the nearest chair, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." The boy shrugged, a little embarrassed by the attention. "It's no big deal," he said, glancing around the cozy living room. "You should get someone to look at your leg, though. It might need stitches." She nodded, wiping at the corners of her eyes with a trembling hand. "I'll call my daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what you did tonight," her voice cracked, and she couldn't finish the sentence. The boy smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that lit up his face. "I just did what anyone should do," he said simply. He turned to leave, but the woman called out to him. "Wait. At least tell me your name." He paused at the door, one hand on the knob. For a moment, it seemed like he might not answer. Then, with a shy glance over his shoulder, he said, "I'm just a kid trying to do the right thing." And with that, he was gone, leaving the woman alone with her thoughts and the makeshift bandage still tied around her knee. She sat there for a long time, staring at the door, tears streaming down her face, not from the pain, but from the overwhelming kindness of a boy who had given so much without asking for anything in return. What she didn't know was that this boy's small act of kindness would ripple far beyond that quiet street. It wasn't just about helping her. It was a reminder of the humanity that still existed, even in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. But the night wasn't over, and neither was his story. Somewhere down the road, the boy walked on, unaware of the impact he had just made. But fate had more in store for him, and this was only the beginning. The boy's footsteps echoed softly as he walked away from the woman's house. The air was cooler now, and the faint hum of crickets filled the night. He tugged at his torn shirt absent-mindedly, realizing he'd have to explain it when he got home. But that wasn't what occupied his mind. Instead, he kept thinking about the woman, how she had been so scared at first, and how her expression had shifted when he helped her. He didn't often see people like her in this part of town. Most elderly folks had family or neighbors nearby. But she seemed alone. Her house, though small, had a warmth to it, a kind of forgotten charm with its flower pots on the porch and an old wind chime swaying gently in the breeze. It reminded him of the home he used to live in before everything changed. His thoughts wandered back to his own family. It had been just him and his mom for as long as he could remember. She worked long hours at the diner, leaving early in the morning and coming back after dark. He tried not to make things harder for her, which meant doing his best in school, staying out of trouble, and helping out when he could. Money was tight, and every little thing counted. The shirt he had torn tonight was one of the few he owned that still fit properly. He felt a small pang of guilt, knowing his mom had worked hard to buy it. But then he thought about the woman's grateful smile and the way her voice cracked when she thanked him. Somehow, that made it worth it. As he turned onto his street, the familiar row of rundown houses came into view. The porch light outside his house flickered faintly, struggling to stay on. He climbed the creaky steps, careful not to make too much noise, and slipped inside. The living room was dark except for the soft glow of the TV, where his mom had fallen asleep on the couch again. He tiptoed over and draped a blanket over her shoulders. Her face looked tired, even in sleep, lines of worry etched into her features. She worked so hard for both of them, and he hated seeing her like this. Quietly, he made his way to his small room, where he tossed his backpack onto the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. He stared at the torn edge of his shirt for a long moment. The night felt heavier now, like there was something lingering in the air he couldn't quite place. It wasn't regret. He knew he'd done the right thing, but a strange feeling, almost like something was about to change. The next morning, the boy woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of his mom bustling around in the kitchen. She was already dressed for work, her uniform neatly pressed. "Morning," she said with a tired smile as he shuffled in. "Morning," he mumbled, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter. She noticed the tear in his shirt immediately. "What happened here?" she asked, frowning. I helped someone last night," he said, keeping his voice casual. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it. His mom raised an eyebrow. "Helped someone?" "An old lady fell near the park," he explained. "She hurt her leg, so I used my shirt to bandage it." For a moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, her eyes softened, and she reached out to ruffle his hair. "You've got a good heart, kid," she said quietly. "But next time, maybe don't ruin your clothes, okay? We can't afford to replace them every week." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'll try." The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but that strange feeling from the night before lingered. At school, he found it hard to concentrate, his mind drifting back to the woman and the way she had looked at him, as if he had done something extraordinary. He didn't think of himself that way. To him, it was just common sense to help someone in need. But by the time he got home that afternoon, he realized the night's events had left a mark in more ways than one. Waiting on the porch was a small brown package tied with twine. He picked it up, his name scrawled across the top in neat handwriting. There was no return address, just the faint scent of lavender that reminded him of the woman's house. He brought the package inside, his heart racing slightly as he opened it. Inside was a folded note and a neatly pressed shirt, almost identical to the one he had torn. The boy unfolded the note, his hands trembling slightly. "Dear young man, I cannot thank you enough for what you did for me last night. In a world that often feels cold, your kindness was a light. Please accept this small gift as a token of my gratitude. I hope it serves you well, though I know no material thing could ever match the value of your heart. With deepest thanks, a grateful stranger." The boy stared at the note for a long time, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, humility, maybe even a little disbelief. He didn't think he'd done anything special, but to this woman it had meant the world. As he carefully folded the note and set it aside, he felt that strange weight in the air again. Only now, it wasn't heavy. It was the weight of possibility, of realizing that even the smallest actions could ripple out in ways he'd never imagined. But as he put the shirt away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, something was stirring, and he was at the center of it. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't turn away when the moment came. Not then, not ever. The boy couldn't stop thinking about the package. The new shirt, the note. It all felt too perfect, like something out of a story rather than real life. He turned the words over in his head, wondering how the woman had known where to find him. He hadn't told her his address, hadn't even shared his name. And yet, the package had been there, waiting for him like it had always meant to be. As the days passed, he found himself glancing at the old park every time he walked by, half expecting to see her again. But the bench where she had sat was always empty, and the streetlights hummed with the same soft indifference. Still, the feeling in his chest, that sense of something unfinished, refused to go away. One evening, a week after their chance encounter, something happened that brought the memory of that night rushing back. He was on his way home from school, cutting through an alley to save time, when he noticed a black car idling at the end of the street. Its windows were tinted, and it didn't move, even as he walked past. At first, he thought nothing of it. Cars parked all the time, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly quiet. But as he reached the next block, he heard the faint rumble of an engine behind him. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the same car creeping along the curb, its headlights dimmed. His pulse quickened, and he tried to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. Maybe it was just a coincidence. He turned the corner, quickening his pace, but the car followed, its tires rolling silently over the pavement. By the time he reached his street, the boy's nerves were on edge. He ducked into a neighbor's yard, crouching behind a row of bushes as the car slowly rolled past. It didn't stop, didn't even slow down, but the way it lingered at the end of the block before driving off sent a chill through him. When he finally made it home, he locked the door behind him, his hands trembling slightly. His mom wasn't back yet, and the house felt too quiet. He dropped his backpack on the floor and went to the window, peeking through the curtains to make sure the street was empty. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions. Who was in the car? Were they watching him? Or was it all in his head? He thought about the package again, about the woman who had written the note. Could it be connected? The next day, he decided to retrace his steps to the park. Maybe there was something he'd missed, some clue that could explain why everything felt so strange. The park was busier in the afternoon, with kids playing on the swings and parents chatting on benches. He wandered to the spot where he had found the woman, his eyes scanning the ground for anything unusual. At first, there was nothing, just cracked pavement and scattered leaves. But then he noticed a small object wedged between the grass and the sidewalk. It was a pendant, silver and worn, with an intricate design etched into its surface. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It didn't look like much, but something about it felt significant. He tucked the pendant into his pocket and headed home, his mind spinning with possibilities. That night, as he studied it under the dim light of his desk lamp, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. On the back of the pendant was a series of tiny numbers, an address. The discovery sent a jolt through him. Was this where the woman lived, or was it something else entirely? He hesitated, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to put the pendant away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But another part of him, the part that had stopped to help the woman in the first place, wouldn't let it go. The next day, after school, he decided to check out the address. It wasn't far, just a few blocks over, in a part of town he didn't visit often. The houses there were older, some boarded up and forgotten, others still standing but barely. The address led him to a small, nondescript house at the end of the street. The windows were dark, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. He hesitated at the gate, his heart pounding. Something about the house felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to step inside. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet street. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, he heard movement inside. Shuffling footsteps, the creak of floorboards. The door opened a crack, and an older man peered out, his face lined with suspicion. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice gruff. The boy held up the pendant. "I found this. It has this address on it." The man's eyes widened, and he opened the door a little more. "Where did you find that?" he demanded. "At the park," the boy replied, suddenly unsure of himself. "I just thought it might be important." The man stared at him for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "You'd better come inside." The boy hesitated, but something in the man's tone made him step forward. The house was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. The man led him to a small living room, where a stack of papers sat on a coffee table. "This pendant," the man said, his voice quieter now, "belonged to someone very important. Someone who's been missing for a long time." The boy's heart sank. "The woman?" he asked. The man nodded. "She's in trouble, and if you've been helping her, you might be in trouble too." The words sent a chill through the boy, and suddenly, everything, the package, the car, the pendant, clicked into place. He had stumbled into something far bigger than he could have imagined, and now there was no turning back. The boy's throat tightened as the man's words settled in the air. Trouble. The word sounded heavier than it should, laced with an urgency that made his pulse quicken. He glanced at the pendant in his hand, its cool surface pressing into his palm like a question he couldn't answer. How could helping her be dangerous? He asked cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned back, rubbing his temples as if trying to gather his thoughts. "It's not just her," he said after a moment. "There are people looking for that woman. Powerful people. She's not just some ordinary person you helped that night. And now that they know you've crossed paths with her." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. The boy's chest tightened further. He thought about the black car that had followed him, the way it had lingered at the end of his street. He had brushed it off as paranoia, but now it felt like a piece of a much larger puzzle. "Who are these people?" he asked, his voice steadier now. The man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the window as though he expected someone to be watching. "It's better you don't know," he said finally. "The less you know, the safer you'll be." "That doesn't make any sense," the boy said, his frustration bubbling over. "If I'm already in danger, I need to know what's going on. I need to know how to protect myself." The man studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed deeply, a sound heavy with resignation. "Fine," he said, "but you need to understand something. Once you know the truth, there's no going back." The boy nodded, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Just tell me." The man leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves could hear him. "That woman you helped, she's part of something big. Bigger than you or me. She used to work for people who didn't want her secrets getting out. and now they're trying to make sure she disappears. For good. The boy's stomach churned. He thought about the woman's fear that night, the way she had looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. It all made sense now, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. "Why would they come after me, though?" he asked. "I was just trying to help." "Because you're a loose end," the man said grimly. "And loose ends make them nervous." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over both of them. The boy's mind raced with questions, but before he could ask any of them, a sharp knock at the door shattered the stillness. The man froze, his eyes darting to the window. "Were you followed?" he hissed. "I don't think so," the boy said, though doubt crept into his voice. The knock came again, louder this time. The man motioned for the boy to stay quiet as he moved toward the door, his steps deliberate and cautious. He peered through the peephole, and whatever he saw on the other side made his face pale. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice tight. The boy's heart pounded as he watched the man open the door a crack. Standing on the porch was a tall figure in a dark coat, their face obscured by the shadows of the evening. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone forced and polite. The figure didn't answer immediately. When they finally spoke, their voice was calm but cold. "We're looking for someone. A boy. We believe he's been here." The boy's breath caught in his throat. He shrank back into the shadows of the room, gripping the pendant so tightly that its edges bit into his skin. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "No one's been here." The figure didn't move, their silence stretching out uncomfortably. "We would appreciate your cooperation," they said finally, their tone laced with quiet menace. "It would be unfortunate if you chose to make this difficult." The man's hand tightened on the door, his knuckles turning white. "I got nothing to say to you," he said firmly. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like you to leave." For a moment, it seemed like the figure might push their way inside. But then they stepped back, their movements deliberate and calculated. "We'll be watching," they said, their voice low. Then, without another word, they turned and disappeared into the night. The man shut the door quickly, bolting it before turning back to the boy. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he ran them through his hair. "You need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Go where?" the boy asked, panic rising in his chest. "Anywhere but here," the man said. "If they know you're involved, they won't stop until they find you." The boy hesitated, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. But before he could argue, the man grabbed a small bag from a nearby shelf and began stuffing it with supplies: a flashlight, a water bottle, some food. "Take this," he said, thrusting the bag into the boy's hands. "And don't go back home. They'll be watching there too." The boy felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His home, his mom, his life, everything was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "But what about you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if they come back?" The man gave him a sad smile. "I've been running from these people for a long time," he said. "I know how to handle them. But you're just a kid. You shouldn't have to deal with this." The boy opened his mouth to protest, but the man cut him off. "Go," he said firmly, "before it's too late." With no other choice, the boy slipped out the back door, his heart pounding as he disappeared into the night. The man watched him go, his expression heavy with worry. He knew the boy's journey was just beginning, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. The boy ran without looking back, his legs burning with every step. The weight of the bag he carried felt like a chain, dragging him further into a world he didn't understand. His thoughts were a blur. What did the man mean by saying he was just a kid? What kind of danger had he gotten himself into? Every street seemed to stretch on forever, every shadow threatening to swallow him whole. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away, and fast. He finally stopped to catch his breath in a narrow alley, the cold night air stinging his lungs. His heart was racing, but there was no time to rest. He could still hear the faint sound of footsteps behind him, soft but unmistakable. Someone was following. His mind flashed back to the figure in the dark coat, the way they had seemed to disappear into the night. It didn't make sense. How had they known where he was going? Were they watching him the whole time? He had to keep moving, but the weight of his decisions pressed heavily on his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, something that could explain why everything was spiraling out of control. As the alley twisted ahead, he heard a soft voice, like a whisper, coming from the shadows. "Are you alone?" The boy froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, eyes searching the dark for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a figure stepped forward from the darkness, a woman's silhouette against the pale streetlight. It was her, the woman from the park, the one he had helped. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped back, the bag feeling suddenly too heavy in his hands. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. She smiled softly, her eyes wary but familiar. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice low. "But I'm not here to hurt you." "Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why did you send me that package?" The woman sighed and looked around, as if checking for anyone who might be listening. "I never wanted you to get involved, but you did something no one else would. You helped me when everyone else turned away." She paused, as if deciding whether to tell him more. "The people who are after me, they're dangerous, and they'll stop at nothing to find me." He shook his head, feeling a sudden sense of betrayal. "But you knew they were looking for you. Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Her expression darkened. "Because I was trying to protect you." The boy's mind reeled. Protect him. All of this, the package, the car, the strange man, had been about keeping him safe. It didn't make sense. The pieces didn't fit together. "Then what's really going on?" he asked, his voice rising with frustration. She glanced over her shoulder, her face tightening. "They're not just looking for me. They're after something I know, something that could change everything." His confusion deepened. What could you possibly know that would matter to them so much? "Something about the people they work for," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it's something I can't let fall into their hands." Before he could respond, there was a sharp noise, a sound like a door creaking open, followed by the unmistakable echo of footsteps. The woman stiffened, her eyes scanning the alley. Without another word, she grabbed his wrist and yanked him towards the narrow entrance of a building. The boy didn't have time to protest, his heart pounding as they rushed into the darkened interior. Inside, the woman pulled him into a small, cluttered room. The door slammed shut behind them, and she quickly bolted it, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "They're getting closer," she said, urgency in her voice. "You don't understand. They're not just after me. They're after all of us." The boy's mind was spinning, but one thing stood out. "All of us?" he repeated, his voice shaking. "Yes," she said, pacing nervously. "They're a network. They've infiltrated everywhere. Businesses, governments, families. And I've been trying to stop them." She stopped pacing, turning to face him. "I didn't want you to get hurt. That's why I had to disappear." The boy looked at her, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about? Why did you help me then? Why give me the pendant?" The woman met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "Because I needed someone to carry on my work, someone they wouldn't expect. You might not be ready now, but you're the only one who can stop them." Her words echoed in his ears. The weight of everything she was saying began to sink in. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. But the fear, the uncertainty, it all rushed back in, threatening to pull them under. "I'm just a kid," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "What am I supposed to do?" She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. "You're stronger than you think. You helped me when no one else would. Now it's time to help the rest of the world." Suddenly, there was a loud banging at the door. The boy froze, and the woman's face paled. "They're here," she whispered urgently. "You have to go." Before he could ask what she meant, she shoved the bag into his hands again. "Take the bag, and don't stop running. You have no choice now." The boy hesitated, the door shaking with the force of the knocking. "But, no time. You have to go." The boy's eyes searched hers, but there was nothing left to say. With one final glance, he turned and bolted out of the room, his legs carrying him faster than ever before. As he burst through the door, the first thing he saw was the faint glow of headlights approaching. He didn't know where to run, but something inside him told him to trust his instincts. As he rounded the corner of the building, he collided with something, or rather someone. And then, the world went black. The boy's vision blurred as he stumbled, his body feeling weightless before crashing into the cold, unforgiving ground. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to rise, his mind racing with confusion. For a moment, he couldn't see anything, his senses disoriented. But then, the soft hum of a car engine filled the air, and his head snapped up. Standing in front of him was the same tall figure in the dark coat, the one from before. He hadn't expected this. The figure reached down and grabbed his arm, lifting him with surprising strength. "You've made a mistake," the figure said, their voice cold and emotionless. "You should have stayed out of this." The boy's heart pounded in his chest, but there was something different in the figure's eyes this time. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was a flicker of recognition, something that made him hesitate. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice hoarse with fear and frustration. The figure didn't answer at first, only pulled him into the backseat of the car. The boy's mind was racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He should have been running, not dragged into some car with a mysterious stranger. He looked out the window, scanning the streets for any sign of the woman, but there was no sign of her anywhere. She had disappeared just like that, leaving him to face the consequences alone. As the car sped off into the night, the boy's thoughts whirled. What was this all about? Why was everyone looking for him? And what did the woman really mean when she said he had to carry on her work? He felt like he was tangled in a web of lies and secrets, and every time he thought he understood, another layer was pulled back. But then, without warning, the figure spoke again. "You're not alone in this," they said, their voice softening just slightly. "I know what you're going through. I've been there." The boy frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. The figure took a deep breath, their gaze never leaving the road. "You're not the only one they've come after. There are others. People like you, like her. You've been chosen, whether you like it or not. And you have a role to play in all of this. A role that will determine the future." His pulse quickened at the words. "What future?" he asked, his voice tight with dread. "What do you want from me?" The figure was silent for a long moment, as if weighing their words carefully. "You have a choice," they said finally. "You can keep running, hiding, and pretending none of this is real. Or you can stand up, face the truth, and do what needs to be done." The boy's head was spinning. "I don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to help. I didn't ask for any of this." The figure's expression softened, and for the first time, the boy saw a flicker of something human in their eyes. "No one asks for this kind of responsibility," they said quietly. "But sometimes, life doesn't give us a choice." The car pulled into a secluded area, the sound of the engine cutting off as it stopped. The boy's heart raced as the figure led him out of the car and into a hidden compound. The air was thick with tension, and he could feel the weight of the decisions hanging over him. Every part of his body screamed to run, but something deeper inside him told him to stay, to face whatever was coming. Inside the compound, the walls were lined with monitors and computers, all displaying cryptic symbols and data he didn't understand. The boy felt like he had stepped into a different world, one where the rules didn't make sense, and the danger was just beginning. As they moved further into the building, the boy was met with a group of people, a small, tight-knit group who seemed to be waiting for him. Each of them was staring at him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being dissected. The woman who had helped him was standing at the center, her eyes locked onto his as if she had been expecting him all along. "I didn't think you'd make it this far," she said, her voice calm but filled with something else, something like pride, mixed with sadness. The boy didn't know how to respond. Everything was happening so fast, and the weight of the moment pressed down on him. "What is all of this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped forward, her gaze softening as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is the beginning," she said. "You were always meant to be a part of this. You were chosen." His mind raced as he tried to process the words. He had been chosen. Chosen for what? And who were these people? His eyes darted around the room, landing on faces that were both familiar and strange. There was something about them, something that didn't quite add up. But before he could ask, the figure from earlier spoke again. "The people who are after us. They won't stop," the figure said. "But we won't stop either. We have a plan, and we have the strength to carry it out. And we need you, more than you know." The boy's heart sank as he realized what they were asking. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. He could feel the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, pressing down harder than ever before. And then, just as he thought everything might be sinking in, the woman spoke again, her words sending a chill down his spine. "There's one thing you don't know," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The people we're fighting, they're closer than you think. They've always been closer than you've ever imagined." The boy's eyes widened, but before he could ask what she meant, everything went dark again. The lights flickered, the sound of alarms filled the air, and chaos erupted around him. The compound was under attack. He didn't have time to think. He didn't have time for anything. All he could do was run for his life, as the shadows of the past closed in on him.